Welcome to the Brainfluence Podcast with Roger Dooley, author, speaker, and educator on neuromarketing and the psychology of persuasion. Every week, we talk with thought leaders that will help you improve your influence with factual evidence and concrete research. Introducing your host, Roger Dooley.
Welcome to the Brainfluence Podcast. I'm Roger Dooley, and our guest today is Dan Ariely, a scientist and author well known to our listeners. Dan is James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University and the author of the bestseller Predictably Irrational. Dan's newest book is Irrationally Yours, on missing socks, pickup lines, and other existential puzzles. Dan, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Well, great. Dan, it's really a pleasure to have you. I think we first met at South by Southwest maybe about 5 years ago, and I'm constantly quoting your research in both my speeches and my writing. One of the things I really like about your research is that it's often really simple and elegant. I'm a Carnegie Mellon alum, and I'm really impressed by the work they're doing there at their CNBC with folks like Michael Tarr, George Lowenstein, and so on. But these guys are using multi-million-dollar fMRI machines and vast computational resources to do their work, where it seems like you get a lot of stuff done with just paper, pencil, and maybe a grad student or two. Explain about your approach a little bit, and what do you think the future for human behavior research holds?
So, first of all, I'm a big admirer of the group at Carnegie Mellon. I had my first job offer from them, and it's truly an amazing team that is so multidisciplinary, and they get so many different things done from so many different perspectives. So I really admire that. One way to think about myself is that I'm not really a good scientist. I'm kind of more of a behavioral hacker. So my interest in social science comes from experiencing some problems myself. And, these include kind of the gateway for me was being in hospital and realizing all kinds of ways in which people did not do things the right way. And I think that sometimes, good researchers basically say, okay, here's a problem. Let me study it for 30 years and let me figure out what the right answer is. And once I know the right answer, we'll turn our eyes toward implementing something. I'm less patient, and I also see much more misery around us. So I basically have a quicker time horizon. And I say, look, let's look at the world around us. Let's look at things that don't seem to be working well. And let's think about how to improve things. Maybe we don't solve it perfectly, but we just improve it. So this applies to all kinds of things, right? So when you go, we recently went to a bank institution for the poor, and you go and you look at this institution and you say, you know what, these forms are just too complex and too difficult, and people actually don't know how to use an ATM. And sadly, when you open people's checking account, you don't open to them savings account with a number that is just one off from the checking account. So then later they don't remember even what the saving account number is. So when you look at life, there are so many low-hanging fruit that are just causing us misery and unhappiness. So I mostly focus on those. So because of that, I think my experiments are relatively simple. They're not always as simple as I wish. But if you look at life and you say, where are the points where people fail? A lot of them actually come to very simple interfaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recall one, I think it was probably described in Predictably Irrational, about people ordering beer samples in a bar. And that just impressed me as being like a great way of combining recreation and research.
Yeah. So, for example, you say, okay, let's study expectations. And one way to study expectation is to do some artificial environment in the lab. Another one is to create, use beer and vinegar as a place where people have expectations. But let me give you another example. This is a research we just finished now. This is a research we did in Kibera. Kibera is a slum in Kenya. And we tried to get very poor people to save a little bit of money. And here's the reason. We don't hope that these people would have money for retirement. But if you're very poor and you live hand to mouth, and all of a sudden you lose one source of your income. By the way, people in Kibera are all small business owners. It is just incredible to realize this. But if you are going to walk 20 minutes each way to get some water, you're going to ask your neighbor if they want some water too. And then you're going to charge them another penny to give their water. So everybody runs a little business. But imagine that you have a goat, and the goat gives you 20% of your income, and one day your goat gets sick. And now you're 20% short. You don't have capacity to overcome this. So what do? You borrow. If you're in Kibera, you maybe borrow at 10% a week, and 4 weeks later, let's say good things happen and your goat is healthy again. Now you're 4 weeks behind plus interest rate. Really hard to recover from that. And now you have to sell maybe you have a pen or a pot or a light or lanternere or something like that. So things deteriorate very deeply. So what we did was we said, okay, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a pre-commitment system. We need to create something where people would have an easy time putting money in and hard time taking the money out. Easy in, hard out. So we teamed up with Safaricom, the cell phone company, and with them you could text yourself some money into a separate account. And every night we got an investment bank to transfer the money to the investment bank. So this way, if you wanted to get the money out, you had to actually take a bus, go to the city, fill a form, get the money. So it will take a few hours. So every time you thought you have some money, you put it in, and then taking it out, you really have to think about it carefully because it was very costly from a time perspective to go and get the money. And then we had different people, we gave them different incentives and reminders to save. And let me describe to you some of those. So some people just got the reminder. Every Thursday we said, hey, it would be a good idea to try and save 100 shillings this week. Other people, we send them a text message from their kids. We said, saving is often not for you, it's from the family. What if we reminded people about the family? Other people got the match. We said, if you save up to 100 shillings, we'll match you 10%. Other people, we gave them 20%. Other people, we gave them what we call a pre-match. A pre-match is based on the idea of loss aversion. So remember, loss aversion is the idea that people hate losing more than they enjoy gaining. So we said, what if we took the 10% or 20% and we put the money in their account up front? And we said, if you save, you get to keep this money. And if you don't save, we'll take it back. So imagine you're in the 20% pre-match condition. I put 20 shillings in your account. And I say, if you save 100 shillings, you get to keep it. If you save 50, you'll get to keep half. 0, I'll take it all back. And then finally, we had another condition in which we made a coin. This was a gold color coin. We told people it was not gold. We asked them to put it somewhere in their hut, and there were numbers on the edge of the coin, 24 numbers for the 24 weeks of the program. And we asked people every week to scratch the coin with a knife and scratch it horizontally if they saved and vertically if they didn't save. So think about all of these methods. Text from kids, 10% post-match, 20% post-match, 10% pre-match, 20% pre-match, and the coin. Which one do you think worked the best?
I hesitate to guess, Dan, because I'm sure I'm going to be surprised.
No, it's okay.
I think that if I had to go with one, I would say one of the pre-match ones would be the most effective, where they would lose it.
Actually, when that's right. And when we do a study and we ask people what their intuitions are, that's what people tell us. And by the way, that's what I thought too. So here is how the results look like. First of all, just reminding people helps compared to not reminding. That's good news for memory. Post-match is slightly better. 10 or 20% don't matter. Pre-match is slightly better than post-match, right, as you predicted. Kids are basically the same as pre-match, right? And 10 and 20% don't matter on the pre-match. But the biggest winner was the coin. The coin basically doubled savings compared to everything else. Now that we know the results, let's think a little bit backward and say, why would, and by the way, my research center at Duke is called the Center for Advanced Hindsight for exactly the same reason you're feeling right now, which is basically, oh yes, I knew that. So why do you
now
think...
Now they have the answer, you can figure out what the cause is.
That's right. But why do you think the coin worked so well? What would be some speculations?
Well, I guess the sensory nature of it would be one, it's tangible, you're holding it, feeling it, scratching it, and so on. Also the tangible nature gives you a sense of your progress, right? Right.
These 24 weeks.
And I guess there's one other little factor too, maybe, that there's some research that shows that currency symbols makes people a little more selfish, and it could be that they're getting primed by that coin too.
Yeah, I think the question of primed and reminders is actually very important. So let me describe to you another research, not by me. This was a research in which they took kids in Oklahoma, and on the day that they were born, they opened college savings accounts for them. And then they waited 4 years and they tested these kids' mental and social skills. And guess what? The kids with college savings account performed better. Now, how can that be? Do the kids know that they're going to college? Of course not. But what's going on is that the parents know that their kids are going to college. Once a month, the parents get a letter saying, this kid is going to college. By the way, this college savings account had less than $1,000. not enough to pay for college. But imagine that you just get a reminder once a month. Now, the same thing happened with the coin. What we find with the coin is that we send everybody a text message on Thursday. Found that with the coin, people saved more on every day of the week. So the coin was part of people's environment. And, that's basically a big part of kind of behavioral economics and cognitive psychology, is to say, when are people thinking about something? You see, especially in the digital world, when do people think about app? Only when they decide to think about it, right? There's nothing that we do externally. Sometimes, of course, we have notifications, but outside of notifications, people think about apps when they think about apps. But the physical thing basically got people to remember something, even if it was not on top of their mind, right? So you could be thinking about a million things right now, and the things that your brain decides to think about are going to direct your behavior. So how do we get you to think more about the things that are good for you, or the things we want you to think about, right? The other thing to realize is that our environment is full of things that relate to spending. There's almost nothing in our environment that represents savings. Right? Think about if you go to your house, what about your house represents savings?
Right. It's obviously very consumption focused.
That's right. So because of that, saving is really out of our minds. So to kind of figure out what kind of things would we do to make savings more salient on people's mind is incredibly important. And you could say the same things, of course, for other domains of life. It's not just about saving. You can get people to think more about their long-term aspirations, insurance, vacations, all kinds of things like that.
And that's really a fascinating intervention. And I love the fact that it's so practical and actually has the potential to benefit humanity and people. That's really great. Hey, Dan, one of the things that really amazed me about your bio were all the things that you're involved in at Duke. I'm just going on the list. You're part of the School of Business, the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, the Department of Economics, the School of Medicine, the School of Public Policy, and even the Keenan Institute for Ethics. I think about the only thing you aren't doing there is helping coach the basketball team. First of all, do you think that this involvement in so many areas of the university reflects a greater desire overall, not just even at Duke specifically, but to incorporate our understanding of brain and behavior work into a multitude of disciplines where perhaps a few years ago that wasn't quite as true?
I think so. I think, one of the nice changes that happened to social science is that we're stepping out of the lab and we're trying to do things world. We're trying to really influence behavior. And I think it's a wonderful move. And, it's kind of a tricky thing with academia, because academia, we have these standards of what's a good experiment, what's a bad experiment. And a practical world doesn't always let us do all the experiments the way we want them. We want to do them. But some kind of healthy mix between academic studies, the way academics do it, and applied research in the way that is helpful for people, I think is very, very good. Now, a couple of things. So one is, I think I'm kind of a little addicted to new experiences. So what happened is that life is incredibly tempting. And of course, the temptations we all know, like, donuts and stuff like that. But for me, academic adventures are really amazing. And there's so many interesting opportunities and tests, and people are doing so many interesting stuff. And I always want to kind of study more and learn more and understand things in a better way. So can I just tell you about a few of my new adventures?
Oh, sure. Absolutely, Dan.
So 2 years ago, I teamed up with a movie producer from New York, Yael Melamed. And so my last book before this one was a book on dishonesty. And I basically tested in the lab how people are dishonest. And we tempt people to steal some money from us, and we see when they steal more and when they steal less. And the results are quite nice and interesting. But there was a question of, to what cheating we see in the lab, the same animal as big cheating that we see on Wall Street, for example. Right? And you could imagine those are kind of represent the same kind of psychology, or that those are very, very different. So because there's not a really good natural way to study big cheating, I can't, start two banks, one of them with code of conduct, one without. We invited all kinds of people who've misbehaved in big ways to come and talk to us in a studio. And we interviewed about 40 people for about 3 hours each. And the stories were just fascinating. And what turned out is that when you look at what those people did at the end, you would say, no, this is not the same as the lab cheating. But when you look at what they did in the beginning, when you looked at the first step they took, you would say, yes, that's exactly what we see in the lab. These are little steps that people could justify, thought of themselves as good people, didn't see how it works. So last week we had the premiere of the movie. It's now out, in digital form and so on. And next week it will be a short version of it will be on CNBC. But that has been a tremendous adventure, right? I started by saying, I don't know how to do this research. Let's film these people. Let's talk to them. Then it turned out we thought it would become a really interesting movie about our dishonest nature. And we kept on moving with that. And I'll tell you something else that we're doing next year. So next year I'm going to teach a class. It's going to be kind of a strange class. I'm going to invite people from municipalities to come and hang out with us for 2 or 3 days and to learn about social science. And at the end, we're going to tell them, look, if there's a problem in your municipality you want to work on, tell us what it is. And we're going to have a year-long class in the School of Public Policy and Computer Science, and we are going to assign teams to you to work on the problem that's interesting. And we're basically going to do this class-based project for a whole year and try to do different interventions in municipalities. And, I don't know how it will work out, right? It could be that it will be great. It could be incredibly difficult. It could be that municipalities will say they want to do things, but eventually wouldn't. I don't know. But I'm really very excited about, just exploring more. Just kind of saying, okay, let's figure out more of what the problems the world is facing. Let's see what we can do to help. Let's try different things. And it's such a wonderful adventure to just try something new.
Right. And that's not that different in some senses from what business schools have been doing for years, where they'll either do class projects with entrepreneurs or even perhaps tackle individual problems in bigger companies as class projects. So that sounds great. Although I think the challenge you might run into is that municipalities have so many players and the power is so diffused in many cases where there's no decision maker. Everything is negotiation, but nothing else. If you can get some issues highlighted, and sometimes people can be brought together and agree on something, particularly if it's coming from a third party as opposed to one particular faction or the other. So that's great. I'm looking forward to learning more about that. And speaking of basketball teams, one news story not too long ago talked about pro basketball teams that were using facial coding analysis to screen their potential recruits. And what they were looking for wasn't so much an evaluation of their basketball ability, but their sort of emotional reaction to situations to see if they'd be a good emotional fit with their team. So do you have any thoughts on that kind of a process? I mean, is this realistic? I guess beyond that too, what's your take on that sounds a little bit like black magic, perhaps, but what's your take on the field of consumer neuroscience and neuromarketing? And that could include not just facial coding, but fMRI, EEG, and all the other tools, even implicit testing and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So first of all, in terms of teams, I think that team dynamics is incredibly important, and it is really not a field that we understand enough in social science. Right, it's not clear how do you get the same group of people to either play like a team or hate each other's guts. And I don't think it's just the individuals. There's something that happens in the connection between them and so on. And I'm not a big sports fan, but I think the question of how do you get people to commit to their team members is incredibly important. And the best people, of course, in that are the Marines. Right, where you basically create these teams that are unbelievably committed to each other, and they look at success as a function of the team as a whole rather than individuals. They also don't make much money, and they're not in the spotlight, so other things happen. In terms of the other part of the question of what do I think is happening with neuroscience broadly defined, I think it's a fascinating area of research. I think that right now it is more on the R&D stage than the real finding stage. Now, it's not that we're not finding interesting things, but if you think about fMRI, for example, the resolution of fMRI is still a little bit too coarse. I know that it sounds strange to say a square millimeter is too big of a space, but in brain terminology, it is
compared to the size of neurons.
Is too coarse. Mm-hmm. That's right. So I think that the amount of investment compared to the amount of learning from the practical world right now is much more investment than learning. But I'm hopeful, right? What I think is we should be cautious, a little bit like the research on priming. So you remember many years ago, there was this research on priming, and people were very quick to draw conclusions from priming. And they say, oh, if you go to the cinema and you see a bottle of Coke flashed for a fraction of a second, people would go and buy Coke. Well, it turns out that doesn't work like this. And people were disappointed that priming didn't work. And companies have abandoned priming and haven't come back to examine it. Even though we have now 50 years of priming and we understand much more about how priming works. And it's actually much more complex and quite incredibly powerful. It just doesn't work the way we thought up front. And I worry, I'm a big believer in neuroscience. How could you not, right? I mean, our actions are eventually a function of our neural activity. And if we're understanding that, we could do a lot to understand human behavior. But I worry that some companies are going to use the gimmicks, don't get as much out of it as they think, and will abandon it, just like happened to priming. So I'm optimistic about the field, but if you said, for example, if you asked me, what is the best way to understand reactions to ads right now? How much of it will be brain imaging versus how much of it will be behavioral? I would say probably right now, behavioral will give you a bigger bang for your buck. Now, in the future, of course, I think you would be able to get much more out of that. The one exception, perhaps, you mentioned implicit attitudes. The one exception are cases where people are trying actively to hide things from you. So if you're doing research on something that people don't want to tell you the truth, now you can't rely on what they're saying. You might get a bigger bang for the buck from using those approaches that don't rely on people being truthful. So looking at small eye movements, looking at galvanic skin response, maybe look at some other measure could be incredibly useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan, I want to get to your new book, Irrational Years. All of your books kind of show you have a sense of humor, but this one is actually the first one that's outright funny, I would say. It grew out of your column at the Wall Street Journal. How did you end up with a sort of a Dear Abby-style column at the Journal? And did they ever object? I mean, they're pretty staid most of the time. Did they ever object to your humorous approach in answering reader questions?
Yeah, so I don't remember how it started, but I think I wrote something in the Wall Street Journal, and I described the fact that people ask me questions. And, because of my history as a burn victim, I get lots of questions for people with different injuries. And they write me to ask me questions about their own lives and how to do specific things. And I wrote about that at some point, and then an editor from the Wall Street Journal said, hey, would you like to try a column? And I was very cautious about this. And I said, you know what, I'll try it for 2 columns and let's see how it works. And I actually realized that, people wrote me lots of questions anyway that I was responding to. And some of those I thought reflect very specific interests, and therefore I only answered them privately. And some reflected some more general interests. So those became kind of the starting point for the column. And I actually get lots of questions from people. I try to answer all of them, mostly privately. I only have, I only answer 3 questions publicly in the column. But it really helped me figure out a bit more about what people are struggling with, which has been really very interesting. And I also love the process. So when people ask me a question, my first step is to say, okay, let me abstract a little bit from this question and figure out what are the psychological and economic forces that actually are present in this question. What is question about beyond the specific instant? So somebody can ask me a question about cars, and I say, no, this is a question about cars, but cars are really about signaling. It's about what we tell other people about who we are. It's about what we tell ourselves about who we are. They're about other things as well. And once you think about the questions this way, now you say, oh, it's not just a question about car, it's a much more general question, and I try to answer those. Now, in terms of the journal being a stiff entity, yes, they are a stiff entity, and there are all kinds of questions that they basically tell me, not here. So there's some answers that they don't like. They don't let me take really political stabs, and sexual humor is kind of not really their forte. But, from time to time I push, from time to time I fail. But I do appreciate them, and I have to say it's a real treat to take a few hours of my week and try to think carefully. And when I write the column, because it's so short, it's 640 words, right? It's not a lot. I basically savor every sentence. It's a bit more like wine for me. I sit and I think about each sentence, and it's really I love the process. It certainly is my sense of humor. When I come up with it, I always think that it will make me and my father laugh. I don't know if anybody else would enjoy it, but I'm happy you enjoyed it as well.
Right. And just to describe the book to our listeners, it's a compilation of probably 90 plus advice questions that Dan answers, sometimes briefly, sometimes in more depth, but usually with not just sage advice and funny advice, but also a little dose of behavior science thrown in to explain why this might be the right answer. And so even as you're chuckling, you're learning. And I thought that was great. And then also, it's illustrated, which is, I guess, maybe a first. There are a whole bunch of cartoons from the New Yorker's William Hefele, which really, I think, just add to the overall experience. I mean, it's just a fun book. How did you hook up with William?
So I loved his cartoons, and he was also a Duke alum. So I asked the alumni office to reach out to him. And they reached out, and he was very cautious about this. It's not his style of work, and I basically convinced him to do one. I said, don't worry about doing a lot. Just let's do one. Let's just try it. And he would get a column, and he would write me 5 one-liners. And I would say, this is the one I want. And it was actually kind of shocking. I would write something that I thought was insightful and concise with 300 words, and then he would send me a one-liner that I thought captured the whole idea. And then I picked the one-liner I liked the most, and he would do the cartoon, and it was such a fabulous collaboration. I am really sad not to get these emails from him with the suggestions of the one-liners, but maybe we'll do another one at some point.
Right. Well, they're really great, and they definitely add to the overall book experience. And then I don't want to give away too much from the book, but let's just give one example to our listeners here. I've had a long-term interest in the higher ed space, and particularly college admissions process. And now high school seniors are wrapping up their school year and getting ready to go to college in the fall. And you had some particularly cogent advice for what these new students should do when they get to college. What you want to explain that?
I think you're referring to the question about what to do with their grandmothers.
Well, yes, that they should cut off their contact with their family during their college years.
That's right. Completely cut it off. And then I go ahead and I describe this research that shows that students in college have a disproportional number of grandmothers passing. And I describe how sad this is, and then the results show that the worse students do in the class, the higher the frequency of grandmothers dying. And shockingly, they die very, very close to the date of the midterm and the final. And of course, we would never suspect students lying about dying grandmothers. And I basically describe this as putting unjust burden or emotional burden on grandmothers. So I recommend that people cut off all ties with their families. And then, of course, I say, no, the reality is that family is incredibly important. Social ties are what keeps us happy. It provides network support. It provides social support. It's incredibly important. So let's not do that. But the results about the frequency of grandmothers dying is just fantastic.
Right. Some probably so numerous that it would be biologically impossible. But that's really great. I'm going to ask you one last question here that's probably like asking a parent which child is their favorite, but I'm going to do it anyway, Dan. You've done so many research projects, and do you have a particular favorite, one where the results were so unexpected or the setup was so simple that you surprised even yourself?
So, I think the coin experiment I described earlier is one of my current favorites. And of course, it's recent, so it could be because of that. But I think for me, the reason it is so interesting is because it's so simple, and I think it holds the key to lots of changes. Right? So it's basically saying, let's recreate the environment that reminds us of what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior, how we actually want to behave. And let's think more carefully about these memory cues. And the moment we can think them, maybe we could get people to behave in a way that they would like to behave. So I think this coin experiment for me is just the beginning of the way. It's certainly not the end, but I think it kind of points to a very important direction.
Right. I can see a lot of spin-off experiments in different domains coming from that. So, okay, well, great. Let me remind our listeners, we're speaking with author and scientist Dan Ariely. Dan's new book is Irrationally Yours, on missing socks, pickup lines, and other existential puzzles. It answers a question: how many behavior scientists does it take to make you laugh? In this case, in Dan's case, it's just one. And you'll really enjoy the book. You'll laugh, but you'll also get some learning along the way. Dan, how can our listeners find you and your stuff online?
So my website is danariely.com, DANARIELY.com, and we have all kinds of videos and information, some descriptions of experiments. You're welcome to join.
Great. Well, we'll have links to Dan's site and the other resources we discussed, along with a text version of our discussion, on the show notes page at rogerdooley.com/podcast. Dan, thanks so much for being on the show, and good luck with the new book.
Thanks a lot, and great to talk to you again. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Brainfluence Podcast. To continue the discussion and to find your own path to brainy success, please visit us at rogerdooley.com.